Shadowversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and a great YouTuber by the name of Brandon F has recently made a video on why muskets are superior to longbows. And it's a great video, and I highly suggest you subscribe to Brandon F if you haven't, especially if you're interested at all in Napoleonic era warfare, weapons and such. Brilliant, brilliant stuff. In fact, one of my favorite videos he's made is actually on how to correctly pronounce huzzah, which has a bit of obviously crossover with the medieval period, because that's a word that's associated with the medieval period a lot. So he makes brilliant content, and this video is no exception. And it, of course, crosses over into some areas that I am particularly interested in, not only medieval period, but I shoot medieval longbow. And you could imagine I have a bit of interest in this subject. Now, absolutely, Brandon's right, okay? And I want to explain the reasons why, some of the things that I feel he actually missed, but also come at this topic from my own perspective, which is, of course, a medieval enthusiast and a medieval warbow archer. Because there's some interesting perspective and context that Brandon isn't aware of, because he's not a medieval enthusiast, and he openly admits that in his video, but he does come at it with the knowledge of an enthusiast and reenactor of Napoleonic era style warfare and weapons. So the reality is, absolutely, the musket is a superior weapon than compared to the longbow. And we get the answer from that from history. Large-scale armies ended up using a musket instead of the longbow. Now, it does need to be said that the longbow as a military weapon remained so well after the firearm was invented, because the first types of firearms were very different to the kind of late 18th, early 19th century and throughout those periods musket technology, so the rifles. There was quite a bit of development and advancement in that technology. When they were first made, there are a lot of issues with them, and we actually have medieval art showing people using bows and firearm technology concurrently at the same time, okay? So the bow still stuck around for a while, but by the time we get to like the Napoleonic era, absolutely it was phased out. And history shows us that, look, they wouldn't have done that if the musket was not a superior weapon. A lot of people throughout history were pragmatists. They used what was effective, especially in warfare, not always, but most of the time. And that gives us the answer right there. So to try and argue that the longbow is actually better than late 19th century musketry is utterly ridiculous. No. But you might say, there's certain advantages and disadvantages, and I want to talk a little bit about that, the specifics, as well as replying to some of the specific things that Brandon mentions himself, expounding a bit further on some things, and I have to admit, correcting one or two things about the medieval warbows, you know, just from my perspective, because I've studied this stuff for a good while. And Brandon, of course, would be able to smash me in my understanding and knowledge of musketry, you know, warfare, firearms, technology, all that stuff. We have our different areas of expertise, but of course his ultimate conclusion isn't wrong. It's absolutely correct. Muskets are better weapons than longbows, and I want to go through all the ins and outs. Now, on the subject of comparing two interesting things, one being clearly superior if you looked at it fairly objectively, took away your own bias, because hey, I like the bow more than the musket. I'm a medievalist, all right? But if you look at it fairly, the answer's obvious. Well, there's another obvious thing that I think you should try for better nutrition, better food, better options, and all like that. And that's the sponsor of this video, HelloFresh. And to show you why it is superior than just going to the shops, just buying your stuff, all the way stuff like that, I'll make some HelloFresh with it. In fact, I'll get my own, I'll supply an army, because this is about army supplies as well. So I'll supply my own army of shadlings with HelloFresh and show you how it's done. And look, I use HelloFresh so much longer than before they sponsored me. I really think it's worthwhile, and I'd like to show you exactly why. And here is my army. How are you, kids?
Good.
Now, like any growing, you're hungry, yes, any growing army, you need to be fed. So we're going to cook some HelloFresh together, right?
Yeah, baby.
Did you know, right? Are you hungry? So because there's a few more mouths to feed in this HelloFresh sponsorship, we're going to be doing a double portion. Beef sausages and Parmesan mash, and beef and rosemary cottage pie. So as I mentioned before, I really recommend HelloFresh. And this is a great time to try because HelloFresh always offers a phenomenal deal with my sponsorships. All you need to do is go to hellofresh.com and use my code SHADOVERSITY14 to get 14 free meals plus free shipping. You can choose from an ever-growing new rotation of weekly recipes, and they feature things like hearty soups, chilies, in-season fall produce, and it enables you to take advantage of the seasoned flavors. There are so many recipes to choose from each week to help you break out of your recipe rut, which is exactly what I found I fell into. Have you found you always fall into the same standard, easy to make kind of recipe list that you just have? Well, HelloFresh really enabled my family to open up the variety in our meals. If you have a larger family like mine, you can increase the HelloFresh box serving so you can easily have enough to cover all those mouths, or have extra left over that you can save for like your lunch the next day. And everything comes pre-proportioned, which means there's less prep time and less waste. Whoa, look at that. That actually looks really good. Cheesy, meaty, yummy.
Just veggies are good.
Veggies are good?
This actually looks delicious.
This looks really good, doesn't it? Okay, my little shadling army, you ready to dig in and give it a go?
Yeah.
Let's try this out.
This is good.
Oh, the cottage pie is great.
I know.
Ooh, what do you think?
Very good. Hey, you guys out there, I think you should get some HelloFresh too. This is amazing.
So I really recommend it. This is something I legitimately use in my own life. I love it. And you can get an awesome deal right now if you go to HelloFresh.com and use my code Shadiversity14 to get 14 free meals plus free shipping. That is an absolutely brilliant deal. Don't miss out, and thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. Before I get to all the ins and outs, I want to talk about the primary reasons, okay? Instead of having you to wait throughout the whole video until I get to the end where I say these are the biggest ones, I'll actually start with the biggest ones right away. So the first point is something that Brandon actually goes into quite a bit of detail in his video towards the end, which I agree with for the most part, except for one interesting point that he brings up. Now, he talks about logistics, okay? The overall logistics of fielding and supplying a longbowman being harder than that of a musketeer. That one I'm not entirely convinced on. I've certainly heard, and you can propose arguments that actually say supplying a medieval longbowman and also keeping him supplied through the length of the journey, or the campaign, was just about as cost effective as a musketeer. The big difference, and this is where I absolutely agree on, is the time it takes to train an effective soldier in a bow compared to a musket. And that's the most significant point about the logistics thing. But in terms of supply and stuff like that, we just know from history that in many instances, not in all, but in most instances, they brought enough equipment and stuff to do the jobs that they needed. And for the most part, archers had enough arrows for the warfare that they were engaging in. Now, Brandon talks about the types of ammunition and how easy to supply and stuff like that, and I agree in terms of weight and overall encumbrance. Arrows are bigger and bulkier than just bullets and gunpowder. But they certainly brought enough with them in many campaigns. They would have full wagons loaded with just sheafs upon sheafs of arrows. Most military archers, when they're given their sheaf of arrow, have between 20 and 40 arrows. That was plenty enough. There's a big, interesting logistical element that Brandon doesn't bring up, and again, because different areas of expertise and stuff like that, and it's that with arrows, you can reshoot them. Once they're shot, you can retrieve them. Oh, this is I broke this one in one of the previous videos. It didn't have an arrowhead. Let me get another. It's got an arrowhead, this one. You can reshoot them. And so after the first engagement, then the things happen and the armies separate back to their camp and stuff like that. A lot of the archers, they'd just go and recollect whatever arrows were still usable, and they could reshoot them. And there's that. And the other thing, in the actual engagement, in the war fighting and stuff, the archers could grab the arrows that were shot at them to shoot back at the enemy. And so that would actually extend the ammunition utility of the bow. And the difficulty in transporting, yes, they're bulkier, but they did it, okay? And so I actually don't feel the cost of supplying a longbowman was necessarily orders of magnitude so different that made them completely irrelevant. If they were still useful on the battlefield, people would they would take the hit of the cost and still field them in a battlefield, because if they're effective, they're effective. And they weren't so much out of the orders of, practicality to a supply compared to a musketeer. In actual fact, the musket is a much more expensive weapon, complex to make as well. One of the interesting things why the longbow, and when I say longbow, the military level longbow, warbow, was so prominent in the medieval battlefield, is that it was cheap to make. It wasn't until it was easy to make. Okay, it wasn't necessarily the best bow. I know, I love the longbow. I'm gonna have a full dedicated video on that. I'm excited to make it. but it had very specific strengths, which made it a very great, cost-effective and economically viable weapon to employ in large-scale battles. And one of the things, when I say it's not the best bow, it's one of the easiest bows to make in very high poundage. That's why it's usually associated more with warfare, warbow ranges and stuff like that. But smaller bows, especially recurves, were absolutely used in warfare and had high draw weights in the warbow range, absolutely. It's a myth that it was only the longbow that was the military bow of the medieval period. Utter bullcrap. Smaller recurves, very common. A whole video coming on that. In contrast, the musket is a far more complex thing to make with multiple components, requiring more manufacturing things to take place in multiple areas that all need to be combined, increasing the cost. And so even though Brandon says that because the longbowman needs multiple weapons, not just a bow to be a really effective, combatant, but usually all longbowmen or just bowmen, will have a sidearm, a weapon for melee. That doesn't mean that they are more costly to equip than a musketeer who just needs that musket, because I think the musket is a fairly complex thing to make. I believe just on average, if you really look up cost effectiveness, in terms of equipping a medieval war bowman, it's going to be a bit mostly comparable. I don't think it's nearly enough to justify to say this is a real valid point that explains why people stopped using bows on the battlefield. They're especially the longbow. The longbows, like I said, are far more, it's a single piece of wood. It's not laminated, all right? It's not multi-layer, you're not doing glue, you're not adding horn or anything like that. It's actually a far simpler bow to make than a lot of other bows. And the big other advantage is that it's simpler to make in higher poundage draw weights, like really high ones, which gives the longbow a unique edge in terms of its design over other ones. So I'm actually not convinced by that argument. But the point about time it takes to train, that is a very significant argument to bring up, because it's true, and we have evidence for it, by the very existence of the crossbow as a weapon that was used in the medieval period very prominently. The crossbow doesn't necessarily shoot in higher poundages than a war bow, not just longbow, but also smaller recurves. I just need to clarify something here, because military crossbows actually got in much higher poundages in their draw weights, but because of the length of the limbs and the shorter power strokes, the overall speed and power of the projectiles they shoot are not necessarily any greater than that of military bows. And it certainly doesn't shoot as fast. So why was the crossbow even used? Ease of use and training, okay? You could give a peasant boy a crossbow and give him a day's, practice with it, and he's going to be aiming mostly in the right direction and still do lethal shots. That's a huge factor. And so, of course, crossbows were used very prominently. Look, of course, that's oversimplifying it. There are other advantages of the crossbow, okay? I'm not trying to denigrate them completely, but there's an interesting thing to bring up about that. But yeah, absolutely, training was a massive thing, okay? It took a long time, not necessarily a full year, but to become super competent, yeah, more than a year's training, in a bow to be really accurate. And longbows are harder to shoot than a lot of other types of bows, and so even more training on top of that. And so if you could get a weapon that could reach similar lethality for less training, absolutely they would use it. And the evidence is absolutely the crossbow. But now we come to the next point. Brandon kind of talks about this, but I don't think he went as far enough, because this is really significant. And also, when we elaborate a bit further on it, I think we'll see some very prominent things. And these are the two big reasons. That first one, ease of training. This next one is huge. And the archery fanboys that try and argue that a good heavy warbow, that's a longbow, again, people get, because I say, longbows are so great, they have penetration and everything. Not all longbows are warbows. And so saying all longbows will be able to penetrate armor is a stupid thing to say. And this is, again, it's related to this other point, but because bows varied in draw strength, you could never guarantee that all the men in your army was shooting at the same level of lethality. A lot of shots were lower in poundage and draw weight, and so they would have less penetrative power, less lethal. And just because, warbows could, and we have evidence of it, go up to 200 pounds, it's utterly incorrect. So to overemphasize and think that every medieval military archer was shooting in that range. No. Most medieval, military archers were not shooting 200 pounds. That's the exception. In fact, the average is closer to 100 to 120 pounds. And the more common higher poundage in the warbow range is about 160 pounds. The 200 pound is the most exceptional high range, and very few people would be shooting at that. So we have differing levels of lethality, whereas you compare it to the musket, most of them are shooting in a very comparable rate of lethality in terms of penetration, range, and all that stuff. But ultimately, this is the main point. This is the biggest reason why absolutely I feel, from my own perspective, the musket is a superior weapon, and totally transfer the bow and replace it, you know, in a military capacity, and the bow was phased out. And it is absolutely lethality. Damage potential, okay? Anyone trying to argue that a bow is as deadly as a musket, you know, like a rifle, you know, musket, no. You're missing a lot of context, a lot of it. It's just not the case. And to try and say that bows can penetrate armor as well as much, no. No, it's not. Tests to be done multiple times. The level of armor was different between periods, okay? Armor was made to the best capacity in the medieval period to resist the weapons of the day. But when you shoot a late 18th century musket to medieval armor, the musket destroys it, okay? Yes, there are certain breastplates made of that period that were able to resist musket fire because it's made to resist it. But medieval armor wasn't made to resist musket fire. Musket fire absolutely destroys medieval armor. The lethality is huge. Now, people then, and Brandon brings this up, that try and argue, well, the advantages of the longbow outweigh its disadvantages. One being the rate of fire. You could shoot, what could we say? I can shoot, I forgot I have like tests and now I've forgotten. I think I got up to nearly 19 arrows in a minute myself, but that's usually a lot higher rate. The averages were anything between 6 and 12 in a minute. But anyway, that's a lot more arrows shot for the 1 to 2 shots you can get off from a musket in 1 or 2 minutes even. So musket's rate of fire is much slower. And I think there's a very key point that people are missing to try and argue that therefore longbows are just as good. And this is the biggest point. If I was to say the most significant reason why muskets replace the longbow, okay, it's this, like understanding of their lethality. And we need to understand it like this. Let's pretend we had some figures that were, and we can actually even just make this analogy with pretend figures that were plucking out of the air. And I don't even think this concession is accurate, but let's just pretend that 4, even 6 volleys from a group of archers is as lethal as a single volley or shot. What do you call like when a whole unit of musketmen fire? Is it called a volley as well? But that's a volley's related. See, this is something I need Brandon to help me out. This is his area. I don't know what fire. What? It's a
firing line.
Firing line. But so when you shoot a whole range of us, it's a firing or a.
I'm pretty sure if. Oh man, you know what?
I'll just say volley. Just say volley.
Ask Napoleon.
Yeah. Oh, Brandon, he would know. Brandon. Comments, mate. Now, a lot of the longbow fanboys, and by the way, I am a longbow fanboy, but I'm not so much that I'm going to be deluded and not see deficiencies, problems in it, and where other weapons have advantages and stuff like that. But the real big Puritans might say, oh, that's unfair, Shad. Easily, if you say a single volley from archers are as lethal as a single volley from musket fire, you're deluded. That's not the case. To try and emphasize this, okay? Muskets shoot with greater penetration. They can leave larger wounds on the person, which is harder, which is more incapacitating, harder for them to recover, okay? It has higher penetrative power. And so if it actually goes through a person, there's 2, you know, exit wounds, more blood loss and all that stuff. Also, on top of that, if a bullet gets lodged in someone's body, it's very hard to retrieve, and there's a high chance that it'll incapacitate or kill someone because it's there. And because if you can't get the bullet out, the wound won't close, and then it'll keep bleeding and all that stuff, and then internal bleeding. So even if you sew up the top, arrows, one, they're more survivable because they don't go as deep. There are more things you can put in the way to protect yourself from arrows, like shields, like other armor and stuff like that. It was never a guaranteed fact that every single arrow shot from a warbow will go through armor. No. It depends on the draw weight, it depends on the distance, it depends on the angle that it hits. But overall, on balance, more muskets will penetrate armor than arrows will penetrate the armor of the medieval period. They're more, just on average, okay? So they're already going to be inflicting more damage, and then the damage they inflict is going to be more lethal because there's greater penetration, the bullets can get stuck, and if you get stuck with an arrow, there's a good chance when you pull the arrow out, depending on the arrowhead, granted barbs runs, but a lot of the arrowheads were bodkin heads, which don't have barbs, so you can be pulled out a lot easier. When you pull it out, the arrowhead usually comes with it, and so it's a lot easier to survive. Infection is a problem later on, but overall, muskets are just way more lethal. Okay? So don't even try and argue that they're not. That's a ridiculous thing to try and say. And so then we can try and make this comparison. How many volleys of arrow fire would reach the same lethality of a single volley of musket fire? Let's pretend it's 4 or something like that. And you might say, well then, hey, this gives the bows an edge, an advantage, because you can shoot easily 4 volleys of arrow fire in the length of time that it takes a musket round to reload. This is missing a very significant point. And again, I think this is the most significant as to why musket fire won out, ultimately overall. And it's this: how do you win battles? All right? If you've studied warfare in any degree, my experience is medieval warfare hasn't done as much in Napoleonic, but I'd say this truth remains accurate, consistent throughout, because it exists in multiple periods, even before the medieval period that I've looked at. You rarely win a battle by killing every person on the opposing side, okay? Most often, they will break, retreat, or surrender. People don't want to die. It's a truism of reality. And so when the morale loosens and one side gets an upper hand, they will break and retreat. And it's only very unique, exceptional circumstances when an army fights the last man. Of course it happens, but those were the exceptions. Overall, you win by breaking and retreating. So, if you can do a large amount of damage in an instant, in a short amount of time, that has far greater chances of causing the opposing side, the enemy, to lose morale, break, and retreat. And so if you could condense the amount of damage that you could do in a minute, like, remember with the longbow, you have to do several volleys to try and reach a certain, lethality pressure, and condense it to an instant. And even if you still had to take longer to reload, which on balance means you've done the same amount of damage than, say, archers could in a minute because they're doing multiple volleys, because you can condense all that damage in a single big smacking hit of all these bullets hitting, think about the effect that has on the people receiving it. When they're attacking and they get hit by all these bullets, friends are falling down, blood everywhere, screaming in pain, stuff like that. That is going to have such a larger impact on the psychology and morale of the opponent than multiple volleys of arrows that do less amounts of damage, but in addition, in culmination, it ends up being the same on balance overall. But because it hits harder and bigger in that one instance, that is going to have a much greater effect in causing the opponent to break and leg it. And that's how you win battles. And so the musket, because it can, even if it's a slow rate of fire, because it can hit like a hammer in that small instant of the first shot, it is a vastly superior military weapon than the bow, even with its slower rate of fire. And so even with that, and I think there are other things that you can talk about, like the fact that bullets are mostly invisible, you can't really see them, they travel faster usually, and arrows are more survivable, you can see them coming, you can't really dodge them, but still, there are small things to get. But if we just even consider there's one significant point, and I think is that, again, I believe it's the most significant. Absolutely, muskets smash as bows, as military weapons, just for that fact. But the thing is, I actually think the lethality of muskets are far more significant, more than just 4 volleys of arrows, maybe even far greater, because they're surprising the types of armor that can protect yourself against arrow fire. Of course, this is the whole point about getting higher poundage bows, to be able to punch through the armor, okay? But it wasn't a universal factor. Not every archer could shoot up to that high level range. So now I want to talk about, that's the main thing, okay? And if you were to take anything from this video, I appreciate, thank you for watching. Those are the main 2 points I really wanted to talk about. Of course, I go into a lot of detail here if you're familiar with my content, as I like. But because this is what I'm like, I like to go into further detail. I want to talk about specific things that Brandon brings up that I either want to elaborate on or share a different, perhaps more accurate perspective from a medieval, historical standpoint based on my own research and experience and things like that. But it's not going to change the ultimate point, okay? Based on the 2 main things I've just raised, the musket is going to be a superior weapon. But there are a couple of things that I'd like to talk about. Brandon brings up the idea of fatigue, and it's absolutely true that a bow is a more physical weapon than a musket. But I think he is putting too much stock in that point, especially to try and justify bows would be phased out. No. If bows were just as effective lethally, just because they can be more difficult and more physically intensive to shoot, they would definitely still use them for the benefit that they're achieving. If you can win battles with them, absolutely. And the other thing is, they are not as fatiguing as Brandon thinks. I shoot warbow range, 100 pound is my average, and I can easily shoot, like in a shooting session, up to 100 arrows before my arms are really starting to get really tired. And granted, that's when I'm like doing it very actively and stuff. So that is more than enough to shoot your full range of ammunition. On average, you're going to have 20 to 40 arrows for the longbowman. But other, you know, warbow archers, reenactors and stuff, like Joe Gibbs, a famous one, he's actually in the video that Brandon shows from Todd's. By the way, I was happy to see that even I appeared in Brandon's videos already, showing, you know, rate of fire and stuff like that. That was a pleasant surprise. Joe has said that, you know, 200 pounds is up, it is max, but if he goes down to something like 160 pound, he can shoot all day without a problem. And so that's actually not an issue, especially because we don't see, I haven't seen any accounts in history where an army was defeated because the archers were so fatigued they couldn't shoot their bows anymore. Fatigue certainly plays a part overall, marching and things like that, but in terms of the actual battle engagement, I've never come across a single instance where the archers were unable to keep shooting when they needed to. So I don't think that's a really strong point to bring up. They're great, absolutely more physically intensive than a musket, but again, training and stuff like that, you condition, you get used to it, and that's not nowhere near as much of a problem. One of the other points Brandon talks about is ammunition. That a medieval archer is going to be able to carry less arrows with him than the average late 19th century musketeer. Yes and no. It's a little more complicated than that. On their person, yes, but remember those wagons I talked about, how they'd have heaps of sheafs of arrows? I mean, you would have people ready to deliver them more arrows on hand, depending on, like, you would probably, if you'd grab 2 sheafs, so you've got 40 arrows on you, but in the heat of the battle, if you shoot all those, you can still get more arrows if there's more in the supply, and usually they would bring heaps. We're talking, they would bring so many arrows on these campaigns, okay? And then again, you can grab your arrows that you already shot, or grab the ones the enemy has shot at you. And then Brandon kind of theorizes something where he says, because of that, they would lessen their rate of fire because of limited ammunition. No, I really disagree with that, but there is times when you would lower your rate of fire as an archer, and it depends on the shooting window that the enemy presents to you. Also, you know, when an enemy is, say, charging their line, for the amount of time it takes to, you know, cross the range and then close that distance, they're not going to shoot 20 or 40 arrows in that small time frame in the charge. Like in Agincourt, you know, if they slow down, absolutely. When the opportunity is available, you will offload as many arrows as possible to defeat your enemy, and you're not going to say, well, we might need the arrows later, so I'm not going to shoot all of them or shoot as fast. No, if you could win the battle by shooting as many as you humanly can in that instance, they will absolutely do it. That's what I personally believe they did in Agincourt, especially when the charge from the French got stalled and slowed down because of the boggy terrain and things like that. That's like golden opportunity. That's like enemy stalled, almost some stationary right in front of me. Friggin' shoot as many bloody arrows as you can. And so, yeah, the idea of slowing down rate of fire to conserve ammunition, I think, no. They might slow down in other instances too. All right, they're kind of vulnerable, but it's not a perfect thing. Let's just see if we can get a couple of shots in, you know? Yeah. But when those golden moments happen, like at Agincourt, where you have the chance to win, you're going to be shooting as damn fast as you humanly can, regardless of ammunition. Because the other thing is, again, you can reuse like archery ammunition. That's a huge advantage, absolutely massive. There is a large point that Brandon talks about in his video that I want to dive into quite a bit. And it is his assumption that the medieval bowman would be a less effective melee combatant than, say, the late 19th century musketman. That is interesting. The reasons he gives is I feel, is assuming that the bayoneted musket rifle is a superior weapon than the weapons that the average war bowman would have. And there's a demonstration he gives which I feel is almost comical in its exaggeration, where the bowman needs to switch from shooting their bow to drawing their sword out, getting ready for melee. And the demonstration they have, the guy is trying to put the bow on his back. Barely anyone in the medieval period, I've seen no evidence for it at all, so I'd almost go fast, no one actually wore the bow over the shoulder like this, like we see Robin Hood do and things. oftentimes the brace height isn't high enough and you have to stretch it out. And I've done this, and look, I can try and do it now. It's really not good. Oh, crap. This is a 120 to 130 pound bow. The amount of pressure on my chest here is extremely uncomfortable. It's like, no friggin' way would you do that. It's ridiculous. And honestly, when someone is charging at you and your life is at risk, the well-being of your bow, keeping it on your person, is a complete non-issue, okay? And so honestly, the speed in, like, you've just shot your last arrow, they're going to get too close, shoot another one and you want to switch, this is how quick it would be. Shoot, drop, draw, you're there. It's that quick, okay? We are not talking about an excessive amount of time, and yeah, you would just drop your bow. Your life is at risk, you pick it up later, okay? I want to show you again, because this point Brandon kind of emphasizes a bit that that amount of time loss was a significant point to bring up in the comparison between muskets and the bows. But seriously, you shoot your last one, you drop, you draw, you're good, okay? That's not long at all. Granted, with a musket, you shoot, and if it has a bayonet, you're ready to fight. But Brandon will need to correct me on this. Again, this is his area. My understanding is that bayonets weren't always fixed to muskets when they're shooting, even in battle, okay? The musket on the end made it more difficult to aim. And so, at times, they had their full volleys, they were shooting without the muskets. Again, I don't know if it was a universal standard to always have the bayonet affixed in warfare with a musket rifle, or it was optional, some would have it, some would not, or they were told specifically, and then when the enemy is getting too close, that's when the order would be given, fix bayonets, they'd fix bayonets and charge. If they needed to fix the bayonet because of a charging enemy is getting too close, that motion would just logically take much longer than drawing a sword, because you have to draw the bayonet and then fix it. That's two actions. This, you can draw the bow, you can drop the bow and draw the sword in one motion together. So that, if you actually want to talk about speed in switching to melee, if the bayonets aren't fixed, the speed is actually in the realm of the archer. But honestly, it would be so small that I don't think it's significant to give, weight to one argument or the other. The one that I do want to talk about is who would be the superior melee combatant once they have their weapons in their hands. And Brandon makes the comparison that a bayoneted musket is essentially a spear. I personally disagree. It's a type of spear, but it's a short, awkwardly made, ill-balanced spear with very limited handholds. Doesn't make it as good as a regular spear of that size, and it definitely isn't as good as a full-length spear. It's an effective weapon, don't get me wrong, but it's nowhere near as fair comparison to just a row of pikemen or a spearman. And the actual medieval archer, okay, most of them will be wearing armor, where it seems like most musketmen aren't wearing armor. And so if you just want to talk about combative effectiveness melee between a medieval archer and a musketman, most medieval archers use one-handed swords. Not all of them, but most did, because they're most convenient. They wouldn't get in the way of the bow when you're shooting, the hand getting the it's just more convenient and stuff like that. But a single sword against an opponent with a single musket, bayoneted musket, is actually it's a closer comparison in terms of which weapon has the edge than just giving the advantage to it. Spears on average usually always have the advantage, but this musket isn't really a true spear. It's a shorter one, or more awkward, ill-balanced, and other things. And I think this is shown by the fact that I believe, there were certain officers or just men in the Napoleonic times who opted to use a sword over a bayoneted musket when it went into melee and had to charge certain ranks and stuff like that. If the bayoneted musket was a universally superior weapon, no one would still be using the sword if they had the option of picking up a musket or have it. That might be explained by the fact that they didn't have one and the sword was the only thing, but I believe some had swords on as a sidearm while they had the musket, and Brandon can correct me, this is his area, but I think even some would drop it and still opt to use a sword, because a sword still has unique advantages that a bayoneted musket doesn't. And so it's not all just a complete cut thing that a bayoneted musketman is better in melee than a bowman who is armed with a sword, because the other thing, most of them will actually, see this armor I'm wearing? This is actually a very historically plausible kind of outfit of a medieval bowman of, say, a 15th century. Brigandine, usually just a tunic or something underneath, or male, but a lot of them, they didn't wear anything, just a brigandine and that's it. A short shirt, like, and I'm even wearing fairly accurate shoes this time. Usually I'm just wearing my regular shoes. And sword. So it's actually a really comparison thing. And it's still armor, okay? This would stop a bayonet. So bowmen absolutely were employed in melee a lot throughout the medieval period. It wasn't their primary thing, but when push come to shove and they need to drop their bows, they could switch to it very quickly, not a problem, and they could still fight very effectively. And so to give the edge to a musketeer because there's an assumption that they're better in melee combat, I think that's incorrect, personally. I understand where it's coming from and where his thought comes from, you know, his analysis here, but this is me looking at it from my experience as a medieval enthusiast, but also an archer, and, you know, having experienced all that. And of course, I've studied just melee combat generally, overall, for a long time. I absolutely will acknowledge that a bayoneted musket by their design is superior against cavalry. Absolutely. That's it. That's a definite advantage, especially with the formations that they could adopt to try and repel cavalry charges and things like that. Definitely. And medieval war bowmen were uniquely vulnerable to cavalry, and they usually had to have either the support troops, backup cavalry or infantry to protect them. They could still fight, but a musket, because it is a type of imperfect spear, but a type, you have certain advantages to try and ward off those cavalry charges. But the thing is, absolutely, bowmen did fight cavalry, and Agincourt is the prime example. Again, more unique circumstances, but the archers were getting into melee heavy, okay, in Agincourt. Brandon brings up a comparison about who would have the advantage in ambushes, and I completely agree with him. I don't think the bow has a unique advantage at all in ambushes, even if they're more silent, because there's a small amount of time after you shoot where the arrows hit and the enemy is then going to be alerted to your presence. You can actually shoot kneeling down with a longbow. I've done it myself. But for me, if I was like this, go like this, and let's see what draw I could reach, even angling it like this. Full draw. But you can't shoot it when you're lying down. So Brandon's correct in that part, but not the kneeling. And because you can shoot lying down, that does give you a unique advantage to hide in certain circumstances better and be able to shoot at the same time while hiding in a prone lying down position. They can't really do with a bow. Advantage to the musket. But overall, no, because as soon as you get that first shot off, enemy's going to know where you are. And look, you can point out the high rate of fire, which we've already addressed, because if you can reach the same damage in a shorter, single shot, even if you have to reload longer, then there's a huge, massive advantage to that, all that damage delivered instantly. Smoke, isn't too much of an issue. Yes, it existed. It's not a game changer. We see that in history. They still used it, okay, and it didn't all, so that's not a one. And the silent, like the fact that bows is quieter, again, these aren't good arguments. They don't make a bow better than a musket overall on balance. No, okay? Again, go back to those first big reasons. The next and last point that I want to talk about is the comparison of accuracy. And I feel I can add more, perspective on this because I've had direct experience shooting longbows and warbows, and I do archery, so of course. I actually don't know how accurate or inaccurate muskets are. Of course, I've heard that they're less accurate than modern firearms and things, but I'd like to know what their grouping is, the average grouping of at certain ranges and stuff. I'd love a video on it, Brandon. Honestly, this would be a great point of comparison, because there is also a lot of misconceptions and misunderstanding about the accuracy in archery generally, but also not just with warbows, but longbows. Longbows are a bit of a different beast when it comes to accuracy. Depends on how thick the shafts are, but also their brace height affects accuracy a bit. But overall, longbows are a harder bow to shoot than a lot of types of recurves, okay? They have other strengths. I'm going to do whole videos on this to go into it. But there's that. You'll never get as accurate, and if you can, you're a superhuman. But most people will never get as accurate with a traditional bow, whether it's a longbow or even recurve, just traditional one without a shelf, without, stabilizers and all these things. A traditional bow will never be as accurate as a modern bow, and this includes modern compound bows and things that they have a special cutout, the arrow is centered and all those things, they have stabilizers and stuff. The modern bows are obviously superior bows. That's why they're made the way they are. We've been doing it for a very long time, being able to perfect designs and, you know, that give greater capacity for accuracy. And so you're rarely ever going to get, I won't say universally, because again, superhumans, rarely ever going to get Olympic level accuracy with a traditional bow. So it's near impossible. I won't outright, say it is, but there's another massive problem with traditional archery, especially medieval warfare archery, and it's that the arrows were supplied to them. Okay, remember they came in those sheaths from those wagons? That means they weren't weighted to the bow. It was random. You didn't know which arrows were going to which bow when you made them, and so the arrows were never balanced to take advantage of the archer's paradox so it would curve around the shaft. That means, in a medieval context, heaps of arrows are going to be wobbling more on release, hit the shaft, and that wobbling, okay, is going to really affect accuracy. And so the highest level accuracy on average for medieval style archery is like groupings of around yay big. And this is at a good distance, okay? And if you can get a grouping of around here, or get all your arrows within this kind of diameter at a good distance, say like 50 meters, that's insanely good for in a medieval context, especially if you're shooting unbalanced arrows on a friggin' warbow. Warbows are hard to aim. You know why? They're hard to draw, okay? To get really accurate, you need a very clean, consistent release. You need to hold the bow steady, okay? And when you're trying to hold back a heavy bow, it's really hard to not shake, it's really hard to keep it steady, it's really hard to get a consistent, clean release. And so absolutely, on average, most medieval archers will nowhere near be as accurate as you can achieve in a modern context. You'll have the prodigies that can get really, really good, and there are examples of like standards that if you could shoot within, it was like a lady's kind of brooch or something like that, at a certain pace, that was kind of a standard. But to be able to shoot like, say, a coin consistently at a target of a moderate distance, in a medieval context, you would only ever get an archer like that, or a couple, a few every generation. And that's kind of what we see in the modern day. So to say that medieval archery is all on balance universally more accurate than musketry, I don't know. I don't know how inaccurate they are. I know that they're not, medieval archery is not pinpoint accurate. Not like always, like all the archers being able to hit a coin at 30 meters or something. No. Warbows aren't like that. So just on a rough kind of comparison on what I have seen and talked about, and referenced for musketry and stuff, the accuracy seems a bit comparable, honestly. I don't know how wide a field the musket balls can, curve at distance and stuff. So if there could be wider variance in musketry fire, because again, it's not my area of expertise. But I certainly know the accuracy levels of medieval archery can be blown out of proportion because it's a spectrum. You'd have some guys that are just insanely talented, but on average, most of all, the best you could achieve, like I said, is probably a grouping of about yay big, and if you can get that at 50 meters, that's flippin' phenomenal. But that means you could hit a human-sized target consistently at about 50 meters or so, even further, right? If you train enough in a medieval context, and that's perfectly enough. But to say that someone could, see an armored knight on horseback at 50 meters and say, I'll get him through the eye slit, that's superhuman. Granted, sometimes we see people like that, but not really, not on average, okay? So I think the discussion on accuracy doesn't necessarily go universally on the side of archery and medieval warfare. And we've kind of come to the end of all the things that I wanted to address in Brandon's honestly great video. I loved it, even though there was obviously one or two things I disagreed with because I'm coming at it from my own perspective, but I've probably got things wrong with, Napoleonic style warfare, musketry fire and stuff, and I'd love to be corrected if I got anything wrong. And Brandon is an awesome creator. And if you have any interest in Napoleonic warfare, also late 18th century, early 19th century musketry, all that stuff, He's one of the best creators I've seen doing this type of content. Go check him out, please subscribe, and thank you for making a video, Brandon. And of course, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed, and of course, I hope to see you again here on Shadiversity. So until that time, farewell.
Delicious.
But it's surprisingly good, isn't it?
Delicious.
It's incredible.
Delicious.
Yeah?
Delicious. Delicious. Delicious.
Nathan, what do you think?
Oh, so good. I don't know.
That actually looked put on. You look like you're faking it there.
Really?
Yes.
Because I never put it on.
You know, this is the behind the scene. Like after we actually film the thing, we just eat the rest of the food, and it's pretty like we wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't good. Was it? Oh wait, Mum, do you want to be on the thing?
No.
Oh look, it's my mum. She joined us for cooking HelloFresh. What do you think, Mum?
It's really good food. And honestly, I can't believe it's cooked on a campfire. I'd go camping with you, Shad.
Oh hey.
Yummy.